Hey everyone, Georgie here with Ukraine Matters. Everything is going as expected, and it goes well into how armed forces of Ukraine have planned it. Now, I'm going to start with the most obvious thing that have been discussed for the last couple of days, and it kind of became the big news. Allegedly, Ukrainians have established first bridgehead on the left side of the river Dnipro around Kherson. Now, I don't want to be a person that's gonna break your party here, but I do have a couple of comments that I must say. It is not completely accurate to say it's the first bridgehead on the left side of Dnipro River. I would say it more correctly, a first publicly discovered bridgehead on the Dnipro River. So we need to understand that military likes to operate in essentially silence. They like to do it, and this is going to be the topic basically on this whole video. But militaries like to operate in a sense that not just the public doesn't know about it, so the enemy doesn't know it. Basically, the more element of surprise and concealment there is, the better it is for the military. In that perspective, the fact that something was discovered by the public does not mean that nothing else is happening. That is the first thing. Secondly, this also exposes a certain problem with media because unfortunately we have struck this situation where analysts like myself, or in this case, Institute for Study of War, needs to be careful on what they are reporting and when, and be careful with their analysis. Roughly, the situation can be considered like this. Ukraine has been doing certain operations to infiltrate Russian positions on the left side of Dnipro River, and Ukraine has been doing it for some time, that we know for sure. And a lot of these reports went and gone unnoticed for a while. And the report that Ukraine has established a bridgehead on the left side of Dnipro was initially reported basically in the same sense. And only because Institute for Study of War reported on it, it got a lot of publicity, and it drew a lot of that publicity for Russians to zero in on this part of the front line, which, as reported by Ukrainians, made things more difficult for them. To put it in more simple terms, some of the Ukrainian soldiers got probably injured, some of the groups were discovered, some of the concealed positions revealed because Russians started paying attention. This could have been done because Russians were just not aware of this, or, for example, that Russian commanders just didn't want to report bad news that they lost some of the positions to their upsides. Remember Vranyo? If you haven't seen the video by Perun, you go watch Perun, he's amazing. But the point is, there are things that even Russian command doesn't know and Russian officers don't know. And that's why it's important for Ukrainians and Ukrainian military to operate in some kind of silence. So we need to be very careful when we are reporting on the actions of Ukrainian forces, that it will do no harm, because in this case, as reported by Ukrainian staff, it did cause harm to Ukrainian operations, which is not good. Next, the third and final part to break the party, calling it a bridgehead is a little bit silly. Because what it actually happened, essentially, it's shown here very nicely on the deep state map, is reports were showing that Ukraine has established bridgehead. People caught up with a lot of the headlines and ran with this. However, when the actual video surfaced, then what turned out is that some of Ukrainians just crossed Dnipro River. They did it on light boats. It was mostly people with light weapons, and basically it's a scouting mission. It's an advanced scouting mission, right? It's yes, it's been happening in multiple points, and it does allow for some control of this. but it still is far away to be considered as a stable bridgehead. One of the big problem of the islands, this part of the river, is that the water, not the water, but the land here is extremely swampy. That's why Russians weren't there, because making fortified positions in these parts is extremely difficult. You start digging in, you dig in about half a meter into the ground, and well, 30 centimeters even into the ground. It's like 2 feet, and then the water starts filling it in from below. So it's impossible to have long-term fortifications. So all of the Russian fortified positions are further. That also creates the problem for defenders. Even if they have some kind of scouting groups there, it doesn't mean that they can prepare some kind of fortified position. It doesn't mean that they can easily also bring heavy equipment there. It's a big and difficult operation. Now, Ukrainians are definitely tackling a lot of those problems, and there are things happening, but this is where I need to be careful with what I'm reporting of what Ukrainians are doing. But what we need to be aware of is that so far, the full-blown discussion about that this is a huge bridgehead, that Ukraine is already preparing like a fist that will penetrate from this direction straight to the entry to Crimea, is not just premature, but most of the analysts, Omala analysts that I've listened to, were very polite into holding on to their chuckles when this were suggested, to put it lightly. Now, obviously, Ukrainians would want to put a threat in the area to draw Russian forces out, but we should not look at this current situation around these islands in Crimea and expect that this is going to cause a major collapse of the front line, or we will see a major river crossing operation from the Ukrainian side. It's not necessary that it's not going to happen, but we're going to talk about it a bit later. Now let's move to the second part of the front line, which is the south. Certain activities are happening in this area. I'm not going to go into details because not a lot of them are being reported on the Russian websites. And as you know, I follow my guidelines that you can read in video descriptions about the OPSEC. And generally speaking, I can describe the situation right now is that Ukrainians are trying to reduce the gray zone in between Russians and themselves. And right now it's close clashes between the first line of defense of Russians and Ukrainians. There are still no major breakthroughs, but again, most analysts do say that it will probably be an escalating offensive. So we'll see increasing and increasing and increasing in the offensive actions that Ukraine will be taking. Moreover, weather is still extremely rainy in Ukraine. It's going to rain minimum until the 2nd of May, and then it needs at least a week and a half of a good warm weather to dry it up, so it will become a really good staging ground for a proper offensive. Then again, as I said, I'm expecting kind of the majority of action to be around May, June. So more towards the June side probably, but the end of May might also be, depending on the weather, I think. Marinka, there are conflicting reports. Again, but the reports are local. There are reports that Ukrainians are pushing and retaking in some parts. Then we get some other day that Russians are coming in and pushing from the other parts. It's a stable position in a sense of that both sides have the capabilities. And the same can be said for Avdiivka. We again have received some of the videos where some weird Russians tried to advance, but it didn't really work out. But since then, it's just mostly shelling towards each other. Now, Bakhmut. So Bakhmut is extremely volatile. Extremely volatile. This is where I believe a lot more liberty needs to be used with regards to the red coloring that the deep state is doing. Now, for example, remember this when we were talking about that Russians are already closing into the road of death or the road of life, however you want to call it. We had videos showing that there are fights happening basically right north of it. Then some other day, we actually received a video showing that there are fights happening south of this road here. And then today we got reports that actually Ukrainians have been pushing Russians all the way up back towards this, to only Russians then to kind of counterattack and push back in. So situation is volatile. Exactly the same can be said for train station of Bakhmut, which is located right here. Now, on this map, you would say, well, look how deep it's colored with red, right? And a lot of daily reviewers like, oh, it's colored red, but now it's taking. But the situation is a lot more volatile. Today, a new video surfaced where Ukrainians are crossing the tracks right next to the train station. It might be a couple of days old, but again, it is not completely clear where and when situation is ongoing. So we need to take the volatility of the situation into account. So take some liberty in thinking that whatever is colored red is not yet fully controlled by Russians, and it's still being challenged by Ukrainians. There's still quite a lot of forces of Ukrainians here. And some people say it's like, well, Bakhmut is mostly captured by Russians. That means Russia win, right? Wrong, because the point of Bakhmut on the military sense, and as I was saying before, is that it attracts attention. It attracts Russian resources towards it. To continue pushing and squeezing Ukrainians out of Bakhmut, Russians still need to commit resources to it. Even if it's just like a third or a fifth or like a small part of the city, if it's still a lot of resources dedicated, then this still plays the role. Let me, like a parallel, it's not a completely accurate parallel, you'll understand, but Mariupol, Azovstal. Azovstal was like just a small piece of Mariupol that was left. But because it was resisting so hard, it had to attract a lot of Russian forces. And the fact that Russia was not able to utilize those forces in other direction, for example, might have saved the further advancements on the southern direction. And then Ukraine would not have as favorable line as they have now. For example, Vuhledar might be completely under Russians now, which is a major point. That is what's the current purpose of Bakhmut, why Ukrainians are still not pushing out. Because it is still keeping the architecture of the battlefield predictable and understandable for both sides. So Ukraine can have a planned offensive based on the existing architecture of the battlefield. But now let's talk, and I'm going to make your life a little bit more difficult with this. What I want to say is that Ukraine is fighting an information war. Information war is a huge part of this campaign. And a lot of military analysts and a lot of militaries in general, what I started the video with, would prefer that their military would operate in complete silence. This is something that Israeli army has been doing. This is something that, for example, Azerbaijani army has been extremely well at executing during their war with Armenia. And we, as we are following the war in Ukraine, we don't feel that. This has multiple reasons, mostly three kind of big categories for why Ukraine is not doing this. And that is that Ukraine is too large. There is just too many people in Ukraine to just easily control. For a full-blown curfew of information that would not allow leak of any kind of specific action, any kind of specific operations, any kind of specific goals for Ukraine would be very hard to do. And yet Ukraine is actually somewhat doing it, except they're doing it with a soft force. For example, They are asking their citizens not to post the movement patterns of HIMARS. They're asking their citizens not to post where the missile strikes hit the cities. So that sense, Ukraine has some kind of soft restrictions on the freedom of expression, but it is still ongoing. Secondly, Ukraine is too free. One of the major aspects and what distinguishes Ukrainians from Russians is that they are a lot more free-spirited. And they are a lot more free-spirited not only in their actions, but also in their thoughts and ways of expression. It is somewhat perceived as anti-Ukrainian to be conservative about your expressions. Ukrainians love to be open. That's why a lot of their parliamentary discussions very often result in shouting, sometimes in older times in like fist fights. And generally, when you see some of the Ukrainian politicians, they're usually a lot louder than some of their European counterparts. That is just the way that the society operates. There is a lot of very, very public discussions in Ukraine. I touched upon this when we were talking about the critique of Ukrainian military in between their own journalists and why it was not the same as for Ukrainians talking to Ukrainian journalists and Ukrainians talking to the Western journalists. Because in Ukraine, it is completely normal for people to just openly discuss certain things. That's just how society operates. And finally, Ukraine is too infiltrated. As painful as it is, Ukraine is still struggling. They still have this problem that Russia spent a lot of money to build a lot of spy networks inside of Ukraine. And clearly, not all of them were exposed. Now, a lot of these spy networks were very defective, and a lot of these spy networks didn't realize their purpose that they were there for. So Russia was not able to capture Ukraine. However, the people still stayed. And I'm pretty sure at some point when they understood the situation, when they adapted, they started again working for the Russian state. And we now still see that Ukraine is still having a lot of problems. And a lot of these problems are coming from the enemy infiltrated assets. And then the next one is that there is still a lot of pro-Russian idiots in Ukraine. There are still people, even in the occupied cities, that see their cities being bombed, and then they are saying, well, it's all the fault of Ukrainians. They just shouldn't have resisted. So they're still very, very dumb people. There are still very, very evil people that just want to support Russia. Because Russia has been infiltrating and bidding a lot of these narratives of anti-Ukraine for a long time. And I know you know that it works on the Western audience, but it also worked on a part of the audience in Ukraine, whether they are supporting Russia in a sense that they want to support big and strong imperial power that's going to restore communism or whatnot, or they are fighting Nazis in Ukraine, or are they trying to resist NATO infiltration, American puppet leaders? There can be 1001 reasons. So to counter that, Ukraine is using the white noise tactic. What they are doing is they've found a way to go around it. So they are pushing a lot of narratives at once. Basically, that's the tactic that was invented by Russians and very actively used by Russians, but now it's being used in Ukraine. So Ukraine, for example, we talk counteroffensive, let's concentrate on one specific things. Not only it will be talked in the public, where from one side it's going to be person saying that the counteroffensive is about to begin, second person saying that the counteroffensive was already started, third person saying that counteroffensive is going to be delayed until the midsummer, fourth person saying that there is not going to be a counteroffensive at all, and then the fifth person saying that the counteroffensive is going to be, but it's actually going to be a Russian counteroffensive. And that's only on the public level. When we go deeper, then, for example, on the military level, general staff of Ukraine will release, for example, I don't know, 14 different plans and start spreading them throughout as rumors throughout their senior command. And at the day of the operation, the day X, Zaluzhny is going to take all those 14 folders with these plans that they spread, says, okay, gentlemen, very nice, then put them in a trash bin and pull out the 15th one. So we need to be aware that whatever insights, whatever plans someone might say that they know, there is little to no ability to verify that these plans will come true. In my recent stream, and you should watch it, it was pretty good, despite being a little bit long, but you should still watch it. I talked about Budanov, which is the head of the Ukrainian intelligence, have been extremely optimistic in how the counteroffensive will go and how soon it will begin. And so far, he has been extremely right. Now, I am very closely following what he said because he's been very right. So we should be very, very careful. But what we will definitely see is that Russians are not going to have a good old time. Thank you so much for watching this, guys. Please, if you want to support me, go to buy me a coffee or press the heart icon with the $sign or become a member by clicking join button on YouTube. Whatever you do helps. Thank you so much for all the supporters of this channel. I love you all. Slava Ukraini, and I'll see you next time.